So yeah, hello all together. It's a big honor to me to present today in an introduction John Weymark. And I fear that all of you, or minimum most of you, know John Weymark much better than I do. So this will be very tough to present, to introduce today. But I asked Manfred if there's something I really must tell, and he only wrote me, no, do not mention this and that. so I had to go to the internet and found such a lot of things about John Weymark, and I did a little bit on some slides to bring it together. Just briefly, born in 1950 in Canada, in the age of 27, made his PhD in Pennsylvania. I'm just clicking around here. And his undergraduate teacher was David Donaldson, who was very important for the subsequent research. And the Dr. Vater, as we would say, the graduate studies had been under the direction of, and I can't read it because of my panel here. This is really ridiculous now here. Sorry. Why is this in front of my PowerPoint slide here? Now, Carl Schell. John Weymark was postdoctorate research fellow at the Center of Operations Research and Econometrics, and was a visiting associate professor at Northwestern University and the Hinckley visiting professor at Johns Hopkins University. He had some faculty appointments at Duke University and the University of British Columbia. And finally, he is a professor of economics and professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University. And for those who don't know where the famous Vanderbilt University is, it's in Nashville, Tennessee. And not last but not least on this slide, John Weymark was the recipient of the Killiam Research Prize at the University of British Columbia. John Weymark did very important work as an editor of economics and philosophy, and managing editor of social choice and welfare. And he supported several journals and served on the editorial boards. And I will not read now all those journals. You all know them. One is the most important journals in economies, but also mathematical, social science, and philosophy. So very broad spectrum here and a lot of editorial work. And again, last but not least on this slide, he is a member of the Council of the Society of Social Choice and Welfare, where he was president in 2008 to 2009. Now about the content. The research primarily focuses on normative issues. So his contribution to the measurement of inequality and poverty includes the introduction of the generalized Gini and single parameter Gini indices, the latter jointly with David Donaldson. John Weymark's writings on optimal tax theory introduced a methodology for determining the comparative static properties of optimal nonlinear income taxes and a criterion known as the Weymark condition that is used to evaluate the optimality and reform the commodity taxes. In social choice theory, he was writing extensively on Arrovian social choice, on economic domains, strategy-proof social choice, and social choice with interpersonal utility comparison. With Charles Blackorby and David Donaldson, he introduced a geometric way of understanding many results in social choice theory, including Arrow's theorem. Now, on my last slide, we come to he applied rational choice theory to address to a number of philosophical issues also. And in particular, he has formalized a critique due to Amartya Sen of John Hassany's decision theoretical justification of utilitarianism that is known as the Sen-Weymark critique. So in addition to his work on non-normative issues, together with Greg Pratt, he has investigated the political economy of income taxation, and with Claude Despermont, Jan Gabricic, and Alexius Chakmar, he was introduced a concept of cartel stability. This sounds very interesting to us, actually, that has been widely used to study environmental agreements. Yeah, today, John Weymark will talk about to us about market virtues and respect of human dignity. And John, we are looking very forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. You see, Market Virtues and Respect for Human Dignity is the title, and I've got three authors. There's three of us. Luis Calderon, who's there, who's currently at NYU Law School and will be joining the Cardozo Law School faculty this fall. Robert Talise, my philosophy colleague, and myself. Okay, you can go to the next slide, please. This paper was prepared for a conference on human dignity and well-being, and will eventually appear in a volume related to it. Markets are often defended in terms of the instrumental role that they play in advancing individuals' well-being and freedom. For example, in Adam Smith. So, there's some brief discussion of Adam Smith, which in the paper, which certainly seems appropriate for an Adam Smith seminar. Friedrich Hayek and Friedman. But in a 2013 Journal of Economic Perspectives article, Luigino Bruni and Bob Sugden offered a different defense of markets. Rather than focusing on the instrumental role that markets play in providing benefits to market participants, they adopt the position of a virtue ethicist and present their normative case for markets in terms of the kinds of considerations that are endorsed from this perspective. Okay, next slide. The classical text on virtue ethics is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and in it, what he calls a practice, which for him is an individual or social activity, is regarded as having its own purpose, what he calls a telos, with its own virtues. And what is the virtue? Virtues are freely endorsed and deeply held character traits or dispositions to act in the furtherance of a practice's telos. The most prominent modern virtue ethicist is Alistair MacIntyre, and in his best-known book, After Virtue, he considers the practice to be a cooperative social activity for which there are goods internal to that practice, and as shall be explained later. And what Bruni and Sugden do is offer a view of market interactions as a MacIntyrean practice with its own market virtues. Okay, so it's quite distinct from the kinds of market analysis that have gone before. For Bruni and Sugden, the telos of a market is mutual benefit, and a market virtue is a character trait or disposition that contributes to the realization of this benefit. Market virtues embody a moral attitude towards market interactions characterized by reciprocity. So reciprocity is providing a foundation for these virtues. They identify what they consider to be 8 market virtues, but make no claims that their list is comprehensive. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now let me just briefly give some fundamentals of Aristotle's views on virtue ethics. For Aristotle, humans have a nature, by nature, have a telos. It's a metaphysical account, namely eudaimonia, which is sometimes translated as flourishing or well-being. Bruni and Sugden do not attribute a telos to individuals. For them, it is practices that have teloi, not individuals. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the position, like I'm actually not a virtue ethicist myself, but what we're trying to do in this paper is be as sympathetic to Bruni and Sugden as we can and adopt a virtue ethics perspective, but from a MacIntyrean perspective, and evaluate their proposals in that, rather than taking issue with virtue ethics approach to evaluation, as a contrast to, say, a consequentialist or deontological approach. And what we suggest is that virtuous market exchange requires respecting intrinsic dignity that each individual possesses and virtues of being a human individual. And the most prominent version of this notion of dignity is, of course, Kant's. And so we are going to consider the Kantian conception of intrinsic dignity. For Kant, and this is where Ken must be just going apoplectic, because he always thinks we should decant Kant, get rid of him. For Kant, an individual who is autonomous and rational is an end in himself and has a value in Kant's terms that exceeds all price. So it's incommensurable with the value of ordinary goods. This value is what he calls his intrinsic worth, or his dignity. Now, what we argue in this paper is that to endorse market transactions from a Mercantilian perspective, so a modern virtue ethics account, it's not sufficient that mutual benefits are realized, that all parties to these transactions intend that this be the case, and that these intentions are grounded in attitudes of reciprocity, which is what Bruni and Sugden do. It is also necessary that nobody's intrinsic dignity is compromised. We're not saying that this is sufficient, but that this is also necessary. Okay, on to the next slide. For a virtue ethicist, morality is primarily concerned with an individual's moral character as expressed by his or her virtues. For Aristotle, a virtuous person is one who cultivates and exhibits those character traits that contribute to or are partly constitutive of eudaimonia. Central to Aristotle's account of the virtues is his metaphysical view of human beings. In particular, to flourish, an individual should endeavor to develop and exercise those dispositions that best exemplify humanity's rational social nature. Okay, so he has these two aspects to human lives and society, that we have that we're rational beings and that we're social animals, and you need to take into account both aspects of humanity. Okay, next slide, please. For Aristotle, virtues come in degrees, and it's a matter of striking the right balance, what he calls mean, between the extremes. To achieve this balance requires practical wisdom, what Aristotle calls phronensis. My Greek pronunciation is probably terrible. On his account, by wisely weighing the reasons for acting one way or another, the virtues are brought into a harmonious whole. For Aristotle, it's really important that that there's a unity of the virtues, that they are mutually supporting. And I'll come back to this in the context of Bruni and Sugden. Like, for example, the virtue of prudence, you don't want to be too foolhardy, but you also don't want to be overly cautious, and that's what he means by striking the right balance. Okay, the next slide, please. Now let me turn to just some of the central features of MacIntyre's view. MacIntyre shares Aristotle's understanding of man's rational social nature, but he regards virtues as being directed at promoting admirable social relationships, not as dispositions that best exemplify some understanding of man's nature. Okay, so it's not, he doesn't adopt Aristotle's metaphysics. MacIntyre has a well-articulated concept of a practice, much more so than Aristotle, and I'm just going to quote from him. A practice is any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. Now, before I go on to the next slide, let me look at a simple problem. Like an example that he uses is like playing a game of chess, and the goods internal to that the practice are analytic reasoning ability and so on, and that you exhibit these by playing the game well. Okay, the next slide. Okay, for McIntyre, practice is not freestanding. It has a history, a social tradition, in his words, whose purposes and standards of excellence are provided by this history. So the society that everything is historically and culturally, socially contingent in McIntyre's account. There aren't, for McIntyre, a virtue relative to a practice is not necessarily a virtue, all things considered. It must also contribute to the good of an individual's life taken as a whole and to the traditions that shape this good. Okay. In contrast to Aristotle, what is good for man is not completely determined by biology. It is also historically contingent on what good the community one is part of is seeking, individually and collectively, in its quest for leading lives that the member of this community regard as being admirable. Okay. Okay, you can go on to the next. Well, actually, can you go back to that slide for a moment? I should elaborate a little bit more. I'll come back to this, but just to preview. But McIntyre really has a three-stage view of virtues. That you have these practices. We interact in different ways, and for example, market exchange, and there are virtues associated with that practice. But these practices are embedded in social institutions and potentially help facilitate leading a good life, and that you have to consider those stages of analysis in order to determine whether you have an overall virtue. That it's not enough to be virtuous relative to the practice, that you also, these virtues have to contribute to a good life and for sustaining and extending the traditions that are partially define what good lives are and that sustain them. Okay, I'll go on to the next slide. I'll come back to that again. Bruni and Sugden argue that markets are a practice in McIntyre's sense. So the first question to ask then is, what are the goods internal to that form of activity? To answer this question, Bruni and Sugden follow Aristotle in regarding activities as having a telos, and for markets, as I've noted, this telos is mutual benefit. And I'm going to quote, Bruni and Sugden propose that a market virtue is an acquired character trait with two properties. Possession of the trait makes an individual better able to play a part in the creation of mutual benefit through market transactions, and the trait expresses an intentional orientation towards and a respect for mutual benefit. So it's in intentional activity. According to this definition, market virtues are, in our sense, virtues relative to the practice of markets. So the first part of what McIntyre considers a virtue. So it leaves open the question of whether they're virtue in McIntyre's sense, because it does not address the question of whether having what Bruni and Sugden consider to be market virtues, in fact, contribute to one's flourishing, to one's to whatever one's conception of a good life is, and whether it helps sustain the traditions that support these understandings. Okay, then the next slide, please. Now, Bruni and Sugden are a little bit ambiguous. It depends on which paper you read, how you interpret some of what they say about mutual benefit. They sometimes talk about mutual benefit and sometimes talk about mutual assistance. And in an earlier paper in Economics and Philosophy, they distinguish between the two this way. Exchange is, they say, exchange can be either mutually beneficial or mutually advantageous. Each acts in a way that is to the benefit or advantage of the other. Still, neither party need have any concern for the other's interest. Mutual assistance implies more than this. The concept of assistance implies an intention on the part of a person who assists to benefit the person who's assisted. We could have trade that's mutually beneficial, but without parties intending it to be so. But mutual assistance actually captures the intention as well. Continuing with their quote, Assistance is intentionally directed towards helping another person in her needs, towards being useful to others. If assistance is mutual, these intentions are reciprocal. Each stands ready to help others in the expectation that they stand ready to help her. And I want to stress this last part. The notion of reciprocity that they're using is a conditional one. Each stands ready to help others in the expectation that they stand ready to help her. It's, you're not willing to just go help other people if they're not willing to help you. Okay, next slide, please. Mutual assistance requires market participants to regard themselves as being involved in a collective activity, with each participant playing his or her part in achieving the collective goal, mutual benefit. Again, I'm following Bruni and Sugden in this. So in McIntyrean terms, they are participating in a practice with the intention of furthering the goods internal to the practice. That is the good of mutual benefit, being the good internal to the practice of market exchange. I should say that McIntyre doesn't really have a sharp distinction between the goods internal to a practice and the purpose of a practice. And in the case of market exchange, Bruni and Sugden are basically arguing that the telos of the practice and the good internal of practice are essentially the same thing, namely mutual benefit. Next slide, please. For this talk, I'm not going to go through the details of the non-exhaustive list of 8 market virtues that Bruni and Sugden identify, but they include respect for the tastes of one's trading partners, trust and trustworthiness. One thing, they also discuss some things which don't belong on the list, such as notions of desert, that you don't deserve the benefits from market exchange. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, in our analysis of Bruni and Sugden, we're going to draw on 2 tests that were introduced by Jerry Gauss, the late Jerry Gauss, and John Thrasher in a volume of essays about the original position. Ken, you have a paper in that one, I believe. They analyze the justificatory role that original position arguments play in social contract theory. They consider 2 tests that principles of justice derived using this thought experiment must pass. First, they must pass what they call the identification test. Individuals with their actual interests can endorse them, not the kind of interest that you are presupposing from the position of an original position. Okay, so it's related to Ken Binmore's ideas that once the veil is lifted, that you must be willing to endorse what's been decided behind the veil. So with your actual interests, you can endorse them. Second, they must pass the recognition test. The principles can be acknowledged as being compelling moral principles rather than some kind of other principles. But what we're going to do is apply these tests to market virtues. Okay, the next slide, please. The question that we address is whether a disposition to intend mutual benefit is something that is self-sustaining and therefore endorsable by the participants themselves. We also need to determine whether market virtues can be provided with a compelling moral justification that is acknowledged as such by the participants. Okay, so that's basically applying the 2 Gauss-Thrasher tests to this context. Okay, next slide, please. Now, we're also going to draw on an article that Timos Athanasiou, Alex London, and Kevin Zollman wrote in Mind in 2015, where they contrast Hobbesian and Kantian conceptions of human dignity. And here's how they characterize the Hobbesian conception. I'm just quoting from their article. The value or worth of an agent is similar to the value of a complex tool. It is a function of the degree to which that agent is needed by, relied on, or is capable of advancing or frustrating the goals, ends, or interests of others. For a Kantian, in contrast, as rational beings, humans have an intrinsic worth. They are ends in themselves and should be treated accordingly. Moreover, they have, in his terminology, they have a dignity that is incommensurable with ordinary tradable goods. They're above all price. Now, I should just say, what Athanasio London and Zollman use this distinction for is to look at the ultimatum game, where I make an offer of how to share the dollar and you accept or reject. If we agree, that's how the dollar is shared, or the euro. And if not, nobody gets anything. And they argue that the Hobbesian conception basically is the standard game theory one, that the recipient must be willing to accept anything. But whereas if you have the Kantian one, if the proposer offers very little, it's an insulting offer. It's insulting the dignity of the recipient, and so would be refused. That's not a very gross characterization of what they do. What they do is much more subtle than that, but that's the basic idea. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so let's to think about these ideas in the context of Bruni and Sugden of markets as a social practice in the sense of McIntyre, with mutual benefit as its internal good and its telos. Let's consider two individuals that are contemplating trading with each other. Baker has bread that he can exchange for wine from vintner. Suppose that both of them agree to an exchange with the intention of mutual benefit. Are they being virtuous in the McIntyre sense? Well, that in part depends on how we understand what is meant by mutual benefit and by reciprocity as the motivation for having the intention to trade for mutual benefit, and whether one thinks of being virtuous relative to a practice or in the more comprehensive McIntyrean sense. Now, in Bruni and Sugden's papers, they're a little vague about exactly what is meant by mutual benefit, and you can have a narrow or an expansive reading of what they do, and we consider both. Okay, so the next slide, please. Okay, so let's first consider a narrow reading. The intention of both Baker and Vintner is to be useful to one another. The motivation for this intention is an attitude of reciprocity. They're trying to be helpful, benefit the other, conditional on them being willing to benefit oneself. So again, it's conditional. The willingness of party to trade with the other person is conditional on the latter being willing to trade with him on beneficial terms. But if that's the case, then really each party is thinking of the other as a tool in the Hobbesian sense that I've described earlier. They're not respecting each other as individuals. Kant's notion of dignity, that they're merely means for achieving benefits for yourself, but you realize that in order to get the benefits for yourself, you're going to have to convey some benefits to the other person. With this interpretation of mutual benefit and reciprocity, these individuals are not virtuous in McIntyre's sense, because this kind of behavior hinders their ability to live out their lives with dignity. They're treated as means, not ends. Okay, next slide, please. So let's think about the identification and recognition tests. Although both parties willingly engage in trade with each other, it is hard to see that they would endorse this activity, given that it offends their dignity. Yes, they're getting mutual benefit, but if the other person is, the person trading with you is, trying to get as much as they can and still leave you some benefits, it's hardly treating you as an individual with ends of themselves. So there's a failure of the identification test. Now, the two parties' reciprocal intentions to be useful to each other are both self-serving and consequently don't provide moral grounds either for their dispositions to trade with the intention of mutual benefit. So there's also a failure of the recognition test. Now, in fairness to Bruni and Sugden, we think that they actually have a more expansive concept of what the intentions of people are when they engage in trade, and of what they mean by reciprocity. So let me turn to that. Next slide, please. Okay, so suppose that neither party thinks of his trading party in instrumental terms. They approach the market exchanges as partners in a cooperative enterprise that they would regard as being a failure if they don't both benefit from the trades that they consummate. Okay, so they realize that this is a cooperative enterprise. You know, they want to be virtuous in their market interactions. Okay, so they're not just out for themselves and recognizing that there's a constraint on how much I can benefit. I have to give the other person enough so that they're willing to trade with me. It's more than that. That we both realize that we're trying to benefit both people, and not just use the other person as a tool in that Hobbesian sense. Okay, so go to the next slide, please. But consider a case where the baker has obtained virtually all the gains from trade. So analogous to what happened in that ultimatum game, where I propose keeping all or almost all of the euro. Well, Vintner has benefited from the trade. The terms are so lopsided. His dignity has been offended. You know, this is the same point that Athanasio, London, and Solomon are making in the context of the ultimatum game. That sure, I intended you to have some benefit, but I don't want you to have much benefit. I want to get most of the gains from trade. The willingness of both Baker and Vintner to propose a grossly unequal distribution of the gains from trade suggests that neither of them regards his trading partner as an equal, one whose worth as a human is valued as much as their own. Neither of them is virtuous in McIntyre's sense, since Kantian dignity is taken, once Kantian dignity is taken account of in addition to mutual gains from trade. So, another way of saying this is that, yes, from the Bruni and Sugden perspective, what they've established is that this is a practice and a social practice in McIntyre's sense. People who intend on the basis of reciprocity to promote mutual benefit are exhibiting virtues relative to that practice. The point is that we have to be a virtue in McIntyre's sense. That's not enough. In addition, you have to be contributing and not hindering the achievement of a good life in however people interpret goodness of their own lives, and also contributing to sustaining and developing the social practices that are part of your culture. And we focused on the second of those, that even though you might intend to mutual benefit for everybody, if you're trying to give limited mutual benefits to the other person, in order to provide you with a maximal amount of the gains from trade, you're hindering their achievement of Kantian dignity. Okay, let's go on this next slide, please. Okay, so really, as a consequence, because of failing to respect this dignity, neither party can endorse trading based on dispositions that could result in market exchanges that insult their dignity. So there is a failure of the identification test. Relative to the practice of market exchange based on an intention for mutual benefits, their moral attitudes provide an adequate justification for endorsing their dispositions. And so, we think it's sufficient for passing the recognition test. But have an intention to play one's part in promoting each party's interests for his or her own sake when engaging in a voluntary mutually benefit market exchange is not sufficient to ensure that the intrinsic worth of one's trading partner, his or her dignity, is necessarily respected, so the parties need not be virtuous in McIntyre's sense. Okay, next slide, please. So a normative evaluation of markets as a practice whose telos mutual benefits implicitly accepts the pre-trade situation, the baseline, as being of no moral consequence for this evaluation. In terms of normative evaluation of practices like markets, Brian Barry has a wonderful discussion in one of his books of this issue, a very extensive discussion. Okay, going back to the text here. But if markets leave part of society behind and thereby hinder their pursuit of lives with dignity, then considering virtues relative to practice of market exchange cannot be sufficient by itself to determine whether the market virtues identified by Bruni and Sugden promote the overall good of individual lives and serve to strengthen those traditions that enable individuals to flourish. Next slide, please. I'm leaving parts of the paper out just in the sense of time. So let me just make a couple of concluding remarks. One can, as Bruni and Sugden do, adopt McIntyre's understanding of a practice and define virtues relative to practice without subscribing to the rest of his requirements for character traits and dispositions to qualify as a virtue. If one does, then virtues associated with different practices may conflict. Bruni and Sugden acknowledge that. However, they do not offer, they just think of them as being, well, those are social facts. We just live with it. However, they do not offer any guidance on such conflicts can be resolved, which is something that McIntyre's approach has the resources to address. And one more slide. Mutual benefit and dignity do not exhaust the human goods that would need to be considered if one were to provide a comprehensive analysis of market virtues from a McIntyrean perspective. Consequently, someone who is fully committed to the McIntyre program would regard a discussion of market virtues, not just that of Bruni and Sugden, as being incomplete. Okay, and then I think there's just one more slide. Okay, so we regard our contribution as supplementing that of Bruni and Sugden rather than being as an alternative to it. Their use of virtue ethics in the normative evaluation of markets has much to recommend, but their analysis requires further development if it's to provide a satisfactory account of market virtues, at least when virtues are understood in McIntyre's sense. Okay, and let me just reiterate something I said at the beginning. What we're trying to do here is adopt this, what seems to be the dominant view of virtue ethics currently, which is McIntyre's, and use it to understand the extent to which Bruni and Sugden's account of market exchange from the perspective of virtue ethics actually satisfies all of McIntyre's desiderata, or whether it's limited by only considering one part of it, which is virtues relative to a practice, and does not consider the other aspects of McIntyre, namely, is the character, your dispositions you have contributing to the goods of a complete life, and whether they help sustain the social institutions and cultures that enable individuals to have good lives. We're not claiming that we all subscribe to the McIntyre perspective, and in fact, we all have some reservations about it. So the exercise has been mainly how would a virtue ethicist from in the dominant tradition now regard Bruni and Sugden's defense. Now, one thing that I probably should have mentioned early on, the motivation for Sugden's Journal of Economic Philosophy article was to take on people like Michael Sandel and Elizabeth Anderson, who have argued for moral limits to markets, that markets lead to people developing character traits that are inimical to virtuous behavior, and they're very critical about people like Hayek and so on. And Bruni and Sugden are saying, hey, somebody like Sandel is a virtue ethicist, but if you're going to analyze markets, let's do it from a market virtue perspective. And that means looking at what are the virtues associated with this practice of market exchange, and that on that grounds, they conclude that we can defend markets, at least relative to that practice, using their analysis. What we're arguing is that that's only part of what's required if you're going to evaluate markets from this McIntyrean perspective. And so I better stop there. Thank you.
So thank you very much. This was very, very interesting. And yeah, let's go to the audience if there's any remarks or questions.
Shanti.
Yeah. Now, I was wondering what would happen if we had a market for sadomasochism. Participants benefited from it, at least they said they benefited from it. That should pass the test that Bruni and Sugden said. But would that pass your McIntyre test?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that just looking at virtues relative to practice, I don't think gives you the material to provide a normative evaluation of the practice itself, and that's where McIntyre's account does. So that, like, if you think about the virtues have to contribute to the overall, to a good of someone's overall life. If you said masochist, not sadism. I think part of the cultures that we're embedded in, masochism is not regarded as contributing to a good life, and so that practice would not satisfy the McIntyrean principles, but relative to a practice, it could be. But related to that, like think about the chess example. Cheating in chess, so you get up to have a cup of coffee, and while you're there, I move one of my pieces, and come back and you haven't noticed it. That, just analyzing it in terms of the practice, could be regarded as being unacceptable and unvirtuous behavior, because you're not really engaged with the practice as with its rules and its understandings. I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. May I add a question here?
Sure.
How can we identify practice? You see, I'm playing cards, and it depends on the card game whether cheating is allowed or not. So it's there's a certain practice, but it takes a long time actually to find out what the practice is, whether you're allowed to cheat or not. There are different cards where you can do it. And if you think a market, I mean, some markets, I think, the practice is that you cheat, and some markets, or most markets, I hope at least, you're supposed not to cheat. But how can we find out?
Yeah, no, and I think that's the experience. And in fact, that's very Aristotelian, that one understands and recognizes what virtues are through experience, and that people gain wisdom. But it's also very consistent with McIntyre's ideas that what's acceptable in one culture may not be acceptable in another, and that it's being part, that there's a history, and that things are history dependent, and so as you become embedded in a culture and in a history and learn more about it, you understand what's what are virtuous characteristics, dispositions for a particular practice, and what aren't. And these can be, they're certainly practice dependent, but they're also can be culturally contingent.
Mm-hmm. But John, if I may add, of course there are markets where people learn what the practice is, and by learning, they violate the practice, and then the practice is changing. So there's a certain dynamics in it.
Yeah, no, agree. And again, I think McIntyre is certainly sensitive to this, that practices evolve, and things are not static. I don't think it's easy to analyze them. And certainly the people who write in this tradition aren't formalizing, like having formal learning and evolutionary. Although they do appear to evolution at points, it's not modeled in any way that I think we can get a real solid grip on some of these issues.
Okay, Ron, go ahead, please.
So I like the analysis, but the only question I have, it really applies to any kind of activity, not just markets, right? You could be involved in political behavior or social behavior or any kind of behavior with others. And the same criteria would apply, right? So,
well,
it's not specific to market exchange.
Yeah, no, that when you look at some different practice, if you subscribe to practices as McIntyre does, having a telos or goods associated, internal goods to the practice, what those goods are will of course be practice specific. To give you an example, because I haven't thought through the political examples that you're thinking about and that you write about. Think about health care, like when or providing care for infants or old people that need help or people who are critically ill. It's not attitudes of reciprocity underlie that practice. What you're, analogous to the reciprocity is, attitudes of compassion. What I think it's Aquinas is misericordia, and in the paper we briefly mentioned there's a person who writes a lot about bioethics named David Jones, who's not using notions of the identification recognition test and so on, but applies the concept of thinking about intrinsic dignity as forming a basis for understanding healthcare provision. McIntyre has another book called Dependent Rational Animals, where he again is also focusing on these issues, but he doesn't really build up the dignity part of it, which is something that Jones does. And there's different kinds of dignity. Like there's like if you go back to Aristotle really doesn't talk about that, but Thomas Aquinas, who's the in medieval times is the person most associated with the virtue ethics tradition, does talk about it. He mostly talks about a different kind of dignity, the dignity one owes to someone in a particular position. So like a father or a leader of some kind. It's obviously very theological because he wants to do it, I think, what's the word, observatia, that you owe to God. but then there are secular analogs to it. But there is some, what Jones argues is that there's some suggestion that even in Aquinas, this notion of intrinsic dignity that we're talking about plays a significant role. So in terms of a serious analysis of a different practice, the practice of providing healthcare or nurturing to those in need, has been done. I don't know if it's been done in any kind of political practice. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just saying, as far as I can tell, it really is not specific to market exchange. It has to do with interactions of any kind.
Yeah, that's exactly McIntyre's point. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But the details will depend upon of what's virtuous will depend upon the practice.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Any other? No raised hands.
Well, this is on something as an aside, since I've got both Ken Binmore and Manfred Haller in front of me, that, Manfred, together with the other editors of Homo economicus, have been editing a symposium in Ken's honor, and many of the papers are now online. And I wrote one using Hans Weihinger's work on fictionalism to analyze the methodology in Ken's work. I just want to say, since I wrote the article, I've learned that Frank Ramsey in Truth and Probability has a discussion of fictions, and particularly talking about Newtonian fictions. And I've learned from Cheryl Mizak's book that Ramsey had been asked by Ogden to help with the translation of Weihinger's book. There's no evidence whether he actually did help or not. And so there's another fictionist and expected utility link that I was not aware of when I wrote the article.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe, John, then you should perhaps maybe write what kind of appendix note, I mean, it's
I don't know if I don't think there's enough there, but it's nice to know that Ramsey thought of everything first.
But it's an interesting detail, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I think so.
Well,
but now Ken wants to say something.
Is, Frank Ramsey is a person you can't but admire. And, for someone like me, I listen to McIntyre, and it just seems a lot of nonsense. And the same is true of Immanuel Kant, so nobody's going to accept that, I know. Whatever Frank Ramsey had to say on any subject, it really made sense. So I want to encourage John. Tell us what Frank Ramsey thought about these things. That would be great.
Or even better, David Hume.
Well, the original paper is pretty good. Everything Frank Ramsey wrote was wonderful. I don't see, what is human dignity? What is it sort of, a basic thing? Human dignity, and we're supposed to adjust our behavior to take account of human dignity. And what is it? It's just something made up to fit into the conventional way of thinking about things. And by and large, I think the conventional way of thinking about things is mistake.
Is what? Pardon me?
Mistake.
A mistake.
There isn't such a thing as human dignity. I mean, it's not a fundamental thing. It's an emergent phenomenon. Here's an equilibrium in the game of life that represents the current social contract. And people look at that equilibrium in the game of life and they try to describe it. And it's a word that's used to describe an equilibrium in the game of life. It's being used as a social contract, but it's not a fundamental. And with McIntyre, trying to make it into a fundamental, I mean, it's just empty. But then, nobody ever agrees with me on these subjects, so I just retreat to silence.
No, but okay, so what you've just done is given a start of developing a Humean account of human dignity. As it rises endogenous, emergent property, and it's essentially conventional in nature.
Human dignity isn't a real thing. But it's not a fundamental thing. It's not something you can build into the foundations of a model. Yeah. It's a description of the outcome.
Yeah. No, I take your point, Ken.
Yeah. Actually, I'm not even saying that virtue ethics may not be useful in sustaining an equilibrium. People might reason along virtue ethics grounds and come to something which happens to be an equilibrium of the game of life, and that will be a useful thing. But it isn't what's fundamental. What's fundamental is that it should be an equilibrium in the game of life.
Yeah, actually, what, I agree with you in the sense that, the question I ask myself is, why do we have these dispositions, and why do we regard them as being virtuous? And you can have a naturalistic explanation of it, that the development of these kind of dispositions is useful for sustaining cooperative activity and promoting the goods of individuals, and that it's a contingent fact of our evolution. It's something that was successful. So I think that's what you're saying. It helps sustain, in your sense, equilibrium in the game of life.
It's true. I think that the various philosophical ways of thinking about things like McIntyre or Kant might well serve a role in sustaining a natural equilibrium, but you just can't take that for granted. Mostly it doesn't. I mean,
yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that viewpoint.
Yeah.
Okay. You're pushing, reading your work and thinking about it has pushed me more and more to kind of a naturalistic understanding of ethics.
Yeah. And
but I think it's worthwhile exploring some of these other approaches to understand them.
Yeah, but there's kind of three layers. There's the biological layer, in which your analysis would be the same as it is in biology, and then there's a social level, which is why do we drive on the right? We drive on the right because of the historical reasons, and we don't necessarily have to explain that. And then there's the philosophical level that you're attempting here, and it may actually be relevant for the reasons that you just gave, but it isn't necessarily relevant. My distaste really for McIntyre and people who write like that is that they invent what you might call axioms, which are not justified. Why should we believe this? And why should we believe that? Why should we believe in the categorical imperative? And there actually isn't any reason. It's we take it for granted because we like the conclusions. But we shouldn't accept conclusions because we like them. We should accept conclusions because they're inevitable. Anyway, I didn't really mean to talk like this because I'm sick with COVID and hardly know what I'm doing.
Oh, I'm
So
sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
I hope it's
Well,
not too serious.
Well, actually, it's quite nice not to be self-isolated and to have the company of you guys.
Well, I hope you have a quick recovery.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, if there's not, I want to thank Gregor for those kind remarks at the beginning and for getting the slides to work. It's much appreciated.
Mhm.
And to Manfred for inviting me to participate in this seminar series.
It was a pleasure, John, to see you again. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure to see many old friends and some new ones. I haven't seen Don Sorry for years, but he used to pop into my office when I spent a year visiting at Northwestern.
What do you mean by old friends? Are you talking about our age?
Oh, we're still young guys. That was just a few years.
You're a youngster, you know. I mean, that's. I realized that you're younger than me. Okay. We come to an end now. I think there's nobody wants to talk now. Oh, Don, maybe you want to talk. I can see your microphone.
It's just that, yes, John I had a lot of nice conversations while he was visiting at Northwestern.
Okay. So it was a great pleasure. And we see again. Is it next week? Yeah, next week we have a session. And then we have Easter holidays, you know. Don't forget this. Okay, so we see next week. Thank you very much. Now I have to thank, of course, Gregor now. He has this double or triple function in this session. And then a great thank you to John.
And for the work at the end.
We
And good
discussed.
health and recreation to Ken, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.